how do you describe the existence of maggots in each setup? In sealed flask, no maggots appear. In flask covered with gauze, maggots appear in the gauze but inside the flask. The open flask, maggots appear inside the flask. According to spontaneous generation, life may emerge from non-living materials. Does the sealed flask setup follows this principle? No, the sealed flask setup does not report spontaneous generation. The absence of maggots in the sealed flask indicates that life does not arise from non-living materials, but rather from external sources.
What was the purpose of covering one flask with gauze in Francisco Redi's experiment? The purpose of covering one flask with gauze was to allow air to enter the flask. To support the vital force argument of spontaneous generation, while preventing flies from directly accessing the meat. This setup tested whether maggots would still appear if flies could not directly contact the meat.
Why did the maggots appear in the open flask but not in the sealed or gauze-covered flask? Well, maggots appeared in the open flask because flies were able to directly access the meat and lay eggs, which then hatch into maggots. In the sealed flask, flies could not access the meat to lay eggs, so no maggots appear. In the gauze-covered flask, flies could lay egg on the gauze, but the maggots could not reach the meat inside the flask. Were there alternative explanation for the presence of maggots in the open flask other than spontaneous generation? Yes, alternative explanation of the flies laid eggs in the open flask, and these eggs hatch into maggots. This explanation contradicts the idea of a spontaneous generation, which posits the life arises spontaneously from non-living matter. Lastly, how do Redi's findings compare to later experiments? So Redi's findings, like Pasteur's later experiment, refuted the spontaneous generation. Redi demonstrated that maggots come from fly eggs, while Pasteur showed that microorganisms come from pre-existing organisms, not from non-living matter. Both experiments supported the principle of biogenesis that life originates from pre-existing life.
John Needham experiment. Number 1. What does the heating or high temperature do with the microorganisms in the broth in the John Needham experiment? Heating the broth is intended to kill any microorganism present.
If the organism died due to the heating, why does the third setup show microbial growth? Well, the third setup shows microbial growth because even though the broth was initially heated, it was not properly sealed. Microorganisms from the air could have entered the broth and multiplied, leading to microbial growth.
Does John Needham's experiment coincide with the spontaneous generation of life? Yes, John Needham's experiment appeared to support the idea of spontaneous generation because microbial growth occurred even after heating the broth, which he thought had killed all existing microorganisms. He incorrectly included that new microbes spontaneously arose from the broth. Number 4. Beside the spontaneous generation, were there alternative explanations for microbial growth in the broth after heating? Yes, alternative explanations include the broth was not heated sufficiently to kill all microorganisms. The flask was not properly sealed, allowing new microorganisms to enter from the air. The broth was not contaminated after heating but before sealing.
How does the Needham's experiments compare Francisco Redi's in terms of addressing the concept of spontaneous generations? Needham's experience seems to be support spontaneous generation, while Redi experiments refuted it. Redi demonstrate that maggots come from flies' eggs, disproving spontaneous generation for larger organisms. Needham's fluid methods lead him to incorrectly conclude that microbes could arise spontaneously, while Redi shows that life's maggots come from pre-existing life, flies.
How is the Spallanzani's experiment different from Needham's? Spallanzani's experiment differed from Needham's in several key ways. Sealing. Spallanzani sealed the flask tightly after boiling the broth, whereas Needham did not always seal them properly. Heating. Spallanzani boiled the broth for longer time than Needham. Results. Spallanzani's sealed flask remained sterile, while Needham's unsealed flask showed signs of microbial growth. How does Spallanzani's experiment prove or disprove the spontaneous generation idea of the emergence of life forms? Spallanzani's experiment disproved the spontaneous generation idea. His results showed that when broth was properly sterilized and sealed to prevent contamination, no life emerged. Number 3. How did the use of sealed flasks in Spallanzani's experiment impact the results compared to Needham's open flasks? The sealed flask in Spallanzani's experiment prevented microorganisms from entering the broth, resulting in no microbial growth. This contrasted with Needham's open flasks, which allowed microorganisms to enter and multiply, leading to microbial growth. How did Spallanzani's experiment address the role of air in spontaneous generation of life forms? Spallanzani's experiment addressed the role of air by showing that air was excluded from the flasks. No life appeared. Even though the broth was capable of supporting life if contaminated, this suggested that air carried the seeds of life, rather than being a necessity for spontaneous generation itself. Were there any criticisms or challenges to Spallanzani's experiment, and how did he address them? Yes, Spallanzani's experiment faced criticisms. One common critique was that sealing the flask and prolonged heating destroyed the vital force necessary for spontaneous generation. Spallanzani countered this by breaking the seals on some flasks, which then showed microbial growth, demonstrating that the broth could still support life when exposed to air.
After the broth was heated, did microbial growth happen in the setup with the long curved glass neck? No. After the broth was heated, microbial growth did not happen in the setup with the long curved glass neck. Why do you think there is no microbial growth in the setup with the long curved open glass neck? There is no microbial growth in the setup with the long curved open glass neck because the curve in the neck trapped dust and microbes from the air, preventing them from reaching the broth. The curve acted as a barrier, so the microbes could not contaminate the sterile broth. What happens when the glass neck is cut in Pasteur's experiment? When the glass neck is cut in Pasteur's experiment, the broth is directly exposed to the air. This allows dust and microbes from the air to enter the broth, leading to microbial growth. 4. How will you explain Pasteur's experiment in connection to the spontaneous generation idea? Pasteur's experiment disproved the spontaneous generation idea. He showed that life did not arise spontaneously from the broth, but instead came from external sources like microbes in the air. By preventing air contamination with the curved neck, he kept the broth sterile, and only when the broth was exposed to air did microbial growth occur. Why did Pasteur use a long curved glass neck in his experiment, and what is its significance? Pasteur used a long curved glass neck in his experiment to allow air to enter the flask, while preventing dust and microbes from reaching the broth. The curved design trapped airborne particles, ensuring that the broth remained sterile unless directly exposed to contaminants. This design was crucial in demonstrating that microbes came from the air, not from spontaneous generation.